Wonderful. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity and for all of you for joining us today. My name is Steve Alexander, and I'm a science advisor with Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And before we begin, I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you all today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin peoples who have been stewards of these lands and waters since time immemorial. It is my great honor to be able to share some deeply collaborative work that I've been engaged with my collaborators, Danika Littlechild, Christine Song, and Nicole, Klenk, where we have been exploring ethical space through the interaction and deep engagement with exemplar cases. And so I'd like to walk through and share some of this work that we're currently doing. Now, ethical space was first articulated by Cree philosopher Willie Ermine. We suggest is a promising framework for working across multiple ways of knowing. Now, this work that I'm sharing has two central objectives. The first is to use the case survey method to identify exemplar cases of collaborative studies that aim to bridge Indigenous and Western sciences in aquatic research and monitoring in Canada. And from there, from the identification of those exemplar cases, our second objective then is to draw upon those case studies to further develop and better understand an ethical space of engagement for collaborative research. Now, from a study design standpoint, there's a few key things I'd like to highlight. First and foremost, we employ an exemplar methodology, and this we're borrowing from the field of developmental psychology. And it's a sample selection technique that involves the intentional selection of individuals, groups, or entities that exemplify the construct of interest, or in our case, the phenomena of interest. And to do that, we specifically employ the case survey method. This involves the integration of qualitative studies. In our case, it's previously published case studies through the transformation of qualitative data into semi-quantitative data via a coding scheme. So where are these case studies coming from, and what's informing their selection and inclusion? Well, we've conducted two systematic maps over the past 3 years. The first, which has already been published, is focused on Canada's coastal marine ecosystems, and the second on Canada's freshwater ecosystems, which is just being finalized. Now, both of these had the same aim, which was to identify published studies that sought to bridge Indigenous and Western science in aquatic research, monitoring, or natural resource management across Canada. Now, we were specifically interested in a subset of those. Across those two systematic maps, we identified 140 published case studies, but we were interested in a subset of those focused on research and monitoring. And so after a secondary screening, we ended up with a total of 62 case studies that we included in our meta-analysis. Now, a reminder that we're looking at these 62 to try to bubble up and identify those exemplar cases. So this is contributing to that kind of exemplar methodology. Now, before I go on, the second piece that to note from the case survey method is the use of a coding scheme. So how do we come up with that coding scheme that we use on those case studies? Well, we've developed a bit of an analytical framework, and for that we turn to three bodies of literature. One, Indigenous research practices, the second focused on community-based research, and the third on participatory action research. And from those three, we get four central themes that emerge: continuity and participation, the importance of ethical practices and standards, taking a value-centered approach, and supporting self-determination. Now, to operationalize these, we turn to three recently published reviews that each had their own respective questionnaires in which they tried to ask and assess published studies related to different aspects of this. Most significantly, though, we build upon the work and extend the work of Dr. David Chavez and Gavin's 2018 review of Indigenous community participation in climate change research. And we extend that with some key questions from these other two. Now, where does that bring us? That leads us collectively then to a coding scheme or questionnaire that involved 46 questions that we then applied to those 62 studies that we included. Now, of those 46 questions, today we're just focused on a subset of those that are going to help us. And from those subset, we've developed a few composite scores. So the first one we're interested in is level of participation. And the second, we're not just interested in the level of participation, but also the quality of participation or the quality of the collaboration. So to develop our composite score for level of participation, we scored, following David Chavez and Gavin's approach, we scored each of 5 stages from 0 to 4, from no participation to being Indigenous-led. And that helped us to get a sense of the overall level of participation. And then for quality indicators, we identified 8 different indicators that we looked for across each of the studies to give a better sense of the extent, the quality of that collaboration and that participation, ranging from accessibility of findings to the whether or not they speak to data sovereignty and intellectual property. Now, from there, we can then plot all 62 cases, and you see that in the scatter plot here. This includes all 62 cases, and moving from left to right, you increase in the level of Indigenous participation, and moving from bottom to the top, you increase in the presence of the number of quality indicators. Now, mind you, our focus of doing all this work was about identifying the intentional selection of exemplar cases. So this idea of, could we bubble up to the top those exemplar cases that we could then further dig into to better understand what an ethical space of engagement looks like and how it might be put into practice. So our first qualitative assessment for that, we identified this cluster of 7 case studies. You'll see where cases overlap, you have a larger dot there representing multiple cases. So we identified 7 cases, but we wanted to further refine our approach to how we identified that exemplar cluster. So to do that, we turned to another method known as hierarchical cluster analysis. So we included the initial 2 composite scores with the addition of a 3rd composite score, which we refer to as project characteristics. And that included whether there was a previous relationship, some key pieces of information related to the overall objectives of the studies, were they Indigenous initiated, and do the authors acknowledge colonization and issues of power. Now, how does hierarchical cluster analysis work? Well, it creates a distance matrix from the composite scores, and that seems very abstract, and it seemed quite abstract to me as well. It's most beautifully put by the brilliant Dr. Alison Horst in this figure and graphic that she developed. So the elements on the left, you could think of those as the case studies. They exist in some sort of state space based on those composite scores. And so there's a distance between each of those cases. And so you can create a matrix there in the middle. And you do a stepwise process of linking those that are closest to each other because they're most similar. And the result is, through this stepwise process, you build up a dendrogram. So what does that look like when you look across all 62 cases that we examined? We get something like this. And immediately after doing this, our first question was, well, where do those 7 cases fall that were blue? Because we're looking to see if this kind of confirms or reinforces what we identified. And we see those 7 cases all quite close together, which was reassuring. But it also suggests that there was 4 more cases that are more similar to these 7 than they are to any of the other cases, thus suggesting we should actually be looking at a cluster of 11 cases that would be exemplar of the phenomena of interest, which was looking at these ethical practices, continuity of participation, to further explore and unpack ethical space. So when we bring that back over to the original scatter plot that I shared, you have something that looks like this. So it's the inclusion of these 11 cases. Now, from here, as I noted, the second objective was focused then on using these 11 exemplar cases of collaborative research that sought to bridge Indigenous and Western sciences to understand ethical space. Now, ethical space is a concept that must be understood in practice and not by abstract theorizing. The specificity, people, situations, histories, and contingencies of the cases matter to how ethical space is interpreted and applied. And this was something that was reiterated repeatedly by Danika as we engaged in this collaboration and this research. Now, it's also important to note that this work here and this manifestation of this visualization that you see is builds on both written and oral knowledge systems. Moreover, this work has been deeply informed by Danika's extensive work with and development of ethical space knowledge and practice over the past decade plus in various contexts ranging from conservation and climate change to health. Now, our collective objective here was to specify and articulate its interpretation in the particular context of aquatic research and monitoring with Indigenous communities. And it's also important to note that methodologically, we are looking not at making generalizations, but rather highlighting salient elements of ethical space. So what you see, this manifestation you see here is both an emergent property and kind of emerged out of the work we have done so far and preliminary engagement with those exemplar cases and the extensive work that Danika has done and the knowledge she brings and has been shared through elders with her. But now we're turning this back onto those exemplar cases to further highlight those salient elements, to better understand the nuances that are important to recognize. So this is ongoing work, and I leave you with that. And thank you for your attention and interest and the opportunity to share some of this work that we're currently engaged in at the moment. So thank you, merci beaucoup, and miigwech.